I never wanted to get married in the first place. But when you're 22 and knocked up and your boyfriend is practically begging you to let him take care of everything, sometimes you just go with the easiest option. David was so eager to play house, so convinced that we were meant to be together forever. And honestly, it seemed like the most practical solution at the time. I wasn't ready to be a single mom, and he was offering me stability and security and all those things that everyone said I should want. So I said yes to his proposal, even though I knew deep down that I was settling for something safe instead of something real. The wedding was small and sweet, and David looked at me like I was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. I tried to feel something more than gratitude, tried to convince myself that this warm, comfortable feeling was love. But even as I walked down the aisle, I knew I was lying to myself. He was a good man, responsible and kind in everything any reasonable woman should want. But there was no spark, no passion, no fire between us. Just this steady, predictable companionship that felt more like friendship than romance. When Emma was born, I threw myself into being the perfect wife and mother because that's what was expected of me, and because David deserved that much at least. He was so devoted to both of us, working long hours to support our little family and coming home every night with this grateful expression like he couldn't believe how lucky he was. I kept waiting for those feelings to grow, kept telling myself that love would develop over time the way everyone said it would. But years passed and I still felt like I was playing a role instead of living my life. David would hold my hand during movies and I'd feel nothing. He'd bring me flowers on random Tuesdays and I'd smile and thank him, while inside I felt like I was suffocating. He'd tell me he loved me every single day, and I'd say it back because that's what wives do. But the words felt hollow in my mouth. I tried so hard to make it work, to convince myself that this quiet, stable life was enough. But I was dying inside and nobody seemed to notice or care. The worst part was how satisfied he seemed with everything. David never questioned whether I was happy, never seemed to pick up on the fact that I was just going through the motions. He'd plan these romantic date nights that bored me to tears, surprise me with thoughtful gifts that meant nothing to me, and make love to me with such gentle tenderness that I wanted to scream. I felt like I was trapped in someone else's life, pretending to be someone I wasn't, and the years just kept passing with no escape in sight. When Emma turned 10, David decided he wanted to start his own business, and that's when Marcus came into our lives. David had met him at some networking event and was convinced they'd make perfect partners. And I have to admit that from the moment I met Marcus, I understood what had been missing from my marriage all those years. He had this confidence, this magnetic energy that David had never possessed. And when he looked at me, I felt something I hadn't felt in over a decade. Marcus was everything David wasn't. Spontaneous, where David was predictable. Passionate, where David was calm. Exciting, where David was steady. When he came over for business meetings, I found myself putting on makeup and choosing my outfits more carefully. And when he complimented my cooking or asked my opinion on something, I felt like a real woman instead of just a wife and mother going through the motions. At first, it was just innocent flirtation. Just the thrill of feeling attractive and interesting to someone who saw me as more than just David's wife. Marcus would stay after their meetings to chat with me about books and movies and ideas. And those conversations were more stimulating than anything I'd shared with David in years. He made me laugh, made me think, made me remember who I used to be before I settled into this suffocating domestic routine. I knew it was dangerous, but I couldn't help myself. When Marcus suggested we meet for coffee to continue one of our conversations, I said yes without hesitation. When he started texting me throughout the day, I responded eagerly and deleted the messages so David wouldn't see. When he told me I was beautiful and that he couldn't stop thinking about me, I felt alive for the first time in years. The affair started on a Thursday afternoon, when we were supposed to be meeting to pick out a birthday gift for David. Instead, we ended up in Marcus's apartment, and when he kissed me, I felt like I was finally coming home to myself. This was what I'd been missing, what I'd been craving without even knowing it. This was what real passion felt like, what it meant to be desired by someone who saw me as a woman, instead of just a convenient domestic partner. For 3 years, I lived a double life, and those stolen hours with Marcus were the only times I felt truly happy. He made me feel sexy and interesting, and alive in ways that David never could. And I started to resent my husband even more for keeping me trapped in a marriage that was slowly killing my spirit. I'd come home from my afternoons with Marcus and watch David puttering around the kitchen, talking about his day or asking about mine, and I'd feel such contempt for his clueless contentment. I got careless with my phone because part of me wanted to get caught. I was tired of hiding, tired of pretending to be grateful for a life that felt like a prison, tired of faking orgasms and interest and affection for a man who had never really known me at all. When David confronted me with the text messages he'd found, I felt almost relieved that the charade was finally over. He stood there holding my phone with his hand shaking, asking me how I could do this to him, to our family, to everything we'd built together. And I just looked at him and felt nothing but irritation that he was making this about his hurt feelings, instead of understanding why I'd needed to find happiness elsewhere. I was sick and tired of hiding who I really was. Sick of pretending that our marriage was something it had never been. So I told him the truth. I told him that I'd only married him because I was pregnant and didn't want to be alone. That I'd tried for 16 years to love him the way he deserved, but it just hadn't worked. That I'd found something real with Marcus, and I wasn't going to give it up to keep living a lie. The look on his face was devastating, but I felt like I was finally being honest for the first time in our entire relationship. David kept trying to convince me that we could work through this, that we could go to counseling and rebuild what we'd had. But what he didn't understand was that there was nothing to rebuild. There had never been real love between us, at least not on my side, and I wasn't going to waste any more years pretending otherwise. I told him I was leaving, that I was going to Boston with Marcus to start over, and that he and Emma would be better off without me anyway. I packed my things that same day while David sat at the kitchen table looking shell-shocked and Emma was still at school. I left a note for my daughter explaining that sometimes adults have to make difficult choices and that I hoped she'd understand someday that I was doing this because I needed to find my own happiness. I knew it would hurt her, but I also knew that kids are resilient and that she'd be fine with David, who had always been the more devoted parent anyway. Marcus had already quit the business and found us an apartment in Boston. And for the first few months, everything was exactly what I'd dreamed it would be. We spent lazy mornings in bed, explored the city together, talked for hours about everything and nothing. He made me feel cherished and desired and interesting. And I finally understood what people meant when they talked about being in love. But gradually, things started to change. Marcus became possessive and controlling in ways that David had never been, questioning where I went and who I talked to, and why I needed friends when I had him. When I got a job at a marketing firm, he resented the time I spent there and accused me of flirting with my male coworkers. He started drinking more and getting angry about things that had never bothered him before, and our passionate arguments began to feel more destructive than exciting. The first time he threw something at me, I told myself it was just because he was stressed about money and adjusting to our new life. The vase missed me by inches and shattered against the wall, leaving a dent in the drywall that we never bothered to fix. He apologized immediately and promised it would never happen again. And I believed him because I needed to believe that I hadn't given up everything for another mistake. But it did happen again. And worse, the verbal abuse became constant, with Marcus telling me I was ungrateful and selfish, and that no one else would ever want me the way he did. He said David had probably been relieved to get rid of me, that Emma was better off without such a selfish mother, that I was lucky he was willing to put up with my baggage. When I tried to defend myself, he'd laugh and say I was being dramatic, that I couldn't handle a real relationship after years of being coddled by my pushover ex-husband. The night he actually hurt me, we'd been fighting about my job. My boss had complimented a presentation I'd given, and when I came home excited to share the news, Marcus accused me of sleeping my way to success. When I told him he was being ridiculous, he grabbed my arm so hard I knew it would bruise, and when I tried to pull away, he shoved me into the kitchen counter. The edge caught my arm and opened a gash that bled all over my white blouse. And as I stood there staring at the blood, I realized I'd made a terrible mistake. But instead of admitting that to myself, I decided to go back home and see if David would take me back. Not because I loved him or missed our life together, but because I needed somewhere safe to stay while I figured out my next move. I showed up at the house late at night with my arm bandaged, expecting him to be concerned and welcoming, expecting him to put aside his hurt feelings and take care of me the way he always had. Instead, David barely opened the door and told me I couldn't stay there, that Emma didn't want to see me, and that I'd made my choice when I left. He wasn't cruel about it, but he was firm in a way I'd never seen from him before. And when I tried to explain about Marcus and show him my injury, he just said he was sorry I was having problems, but that they weren't his problems anymore. That's when Emma appeared behind him in the hallway, and the look on her face was pure hatred. My own daughter, who I'd carried and raised and loved, looked at me like I was a stranger who had hurt her family. She called me a cruel and heartless monster, said I'd failed as both a wife and a mother, and told me that I'd dug my own grave and now I had to lie in it. Then she slammed the door in my face, and I stood there on the porch realizing that I'd lost everything and had nowhere left to go. I decided to fight for custody, not because I particularly wanted the responsibility of raising a teenager who hated me, but because I needed some kind of leverage to get back into their lives. I hired a lawyer and filed papers demanding weekend visitation and shared custody, thinking that David would be reasonable and we could work out some kind of arrangement that would give me a place to stay and a way back into the family I'd walked away from. But David had changed in ways I hadn't expected. The man who used to accommodate my every mood and beg for my approval had developed a backbone, and he fought my custody petition with a determination that surprised me. His lawyer presented evidence of my abandonment, my complete lack of contact with Emma for months, my affair, and the way I'd destroyed our marriage. They painted me as an unfit mother who had chosen her own selfish desires over her child's well-being. Marcus kept calling David's house trying to find me, begging him to tell me to come back to Boston. But David refused to help him and gave him my parents' phone number instead. Even Marcus's desperation couldn't convince David to get involved in our drama. And I realized that the man I'd taken for granted for so many years had finally learned to protect himself and his daughter from people who would hurt them. The mediation sessions were disasters. I wanted weekend custody and for David to give Marcus his partnership back in the business, thinking we could all find a way to coexist and move forward. But David refused every compromise I suggested. He said Emma didn't want to see me, that she was in therapy dealing with the abandonment issues I'd caused, and that he wasn't going to force a relationship that would only hurt her more. When I showed up to our final meeting with Marcus, hoping that seeing my injury and understanding what I'd been through would make David more sympathetic, he just looked tired and disappointed. Marcus tried to explain that we'd both learned from our mistakes and wanted to make things right. But David said we'd had our chance to think about consequences before we destroyed 2 families, and that he wasn't interested in helping us clean up the mess we'd made. Now I'm stuck in this impossible situation where I've lost everything and everyone expects me to just accept it and move on. My job in Boston is threatening to fire me if I don't come back soon. But Marcus is still there and still dangerous, and I have nowhere else to go. Emma won't speak to me. David has moved on and built a life that doesn't include me. And even my own parents think I brought this all on myself by being selfish and ungrateful. Everyone acts like I'm the villain in this story. But nobody wants to acknowledge that I was suffocating in that marriage. That I deserved to find real love and passion instead of settling for a comfortable arrangement that was slowly killing my soul. Yes, I made mistakes. But I was trying to find happiness after years of pretending to be satisfied with a life that never felt like mine. David got to be the devoted husband and father. But what did I get except the obligation to be grateful for a love I never asked for and couldn't return? I know Emma will probably never forgive me, and maybe that's for the best, since she clearly inherited her father's talent for holding grudges and making people feel guilty for wanting something more than suburban mediocrity. David has his business and his righteous wounded husband act, and everyone thinks he's some kind of saint for taking such good care of our daughter after I abandoned them. But nobody talks about the years I spent trying to love him, trying to be the wife he wanted, trying to make a marriage work that was doomed from the start because it was built on my desperation instead of genuine feeling. I suppose I'll have to go back to Boston eventually and find a way to deal with Marcus. Or maybe I'll start over somewhere completely new where nobody knows about my failures and mistakes. But I'm tired of being blamed for finally choosing myself for once. Tired of being expected to sacrifice my happiness for people who never really understood me anyway. I gave David and Emma 16 years of my life. And if that's not enough for them, then maybe they never deserved me in the first place. The truth is that some people aren't meant for the traditional family life, and I was foolish to think I could force myself into that mold just because it was expected of me. I should have been honest from the beginning about what I wanted and needed, but instead I tried to be the person everyone else wanted me to be, and we all ended up hurt because of it. Maybe if David had been more exciting, more passionate, more attentive to my needs, things would have been different. Maybe if Emma had been more understanding about adult relationships and the complexity of human emotions, she wouldn't have turned against me so completely. But I can't change the past, and I refuse to spend the rest of my life apologizing for finally having the courage to pursue real love and authentic happiness. Everyone else will have to find their own way to deal with the choices I made. Just like I'm dealing with the consequences of trusting the wrong person and believing that someone who seems so different from David would actually treat me better. At least I know now that I'm strong enough to survive on my own, even when everyone I thought I could count on turns their back on me when I need them most.